Hey, church or YouTube people or whoever is going to watch this. I know at least my mom will, and probably a few others. So, um, yeah, I had the idea a month ago. I wanted to interview my grandpa because his life and his ministry and his story, I just wanted it for myself.
Yep.
And what I found is actually a lot of other people wanted it too. And I think something for me that's happening as I come out of my 30s and into my 40s this year is I really want to capture stories of men and women who've gone before me. I want to hear from them. This is more for me. I'll post to social media, but this is an awesome opportunity. So today I've asked Stu Weber to do an interview with us. And Stu, just to kind of introduce Stu is and kind of is in some ways always will be my pastor from Good Shepherd. I knew Stu as a fourth or fifth grader when I came to the church, and he and Randy Alcorn, Steve Keels, these guys were larger than life to me. I ended up as a pastor on staff there working with Stu, and I'll never forget the first time he asked me to preach at the main service. I was 23 years old. I believe it was either John Piper or Randy Alcorn the week before me. So thanks for that.
Yeah.
That was really nice of you. Maybe you could have had like John MacArthur right after me or something. I don't know.
Yeah.
But he believed in me, and Stu
Absolutely.
took a risk, and so a lot of grace on my life through this
I
man.
still do, Ryan. I still do. I take pride in you, in fact.
Yeah, thanks, buddy. And so I just thought, man, it'd be fun. And Stu, he's retired now. He has time. He's not flying all over the place, speaking everywhere, although he still does a
The
lot of
government
that.
thought of that. The government canceled all the engagements.
Yeah. So he's a free agent right now. So he's YouTubing with me now. So Stu, I just want to start by asking, like, tell us your conversion story. How did you come to faith? And maybe faith, your college years, and your call to ministry. Kind of put that into the first question, maybe 5 minutes on that.
I was going to say, how much time do we have?
Yeah.
Long and short of it, I grew up in a coal mining town with some wonderful but rough characters, and confessed Christ as a youngster in my father's home, who was a giant of a man, humble, quiet, unlike me. I'm talking all the time. He was a quiet man, but he was my hero, and we lost him here at age 94 and a half, just about 3 years ago. I still think about him every day. Giant in my life, and nobody ever told me I want to be like my dad, but I think there's something inherent in every little boy that wants to be like his father. And so I was always aware of his devotion to Christ and his heart for the Lord and his anticipation of heaven, and so that was always there. And then, when you're a boy growing up and you go to junior high in the early 60s, and you go to high school and graduate, and still in the early 60s, and then you go to college, and it's the middle 60s, and the country's falling apart. And even though I went to an excellent Christian school and value it intensely, I think a lot of us who were raised in evangelical homes go through this. It's part of the process of making your faith your own. Maybe I'm a late bloomer, but I didn't really begin to doubt until I was probably 19. And then I began to wonder if my dear parents weren't the unwitting victims of some historical conspiracy,
Yeah.
And so the Lord put me into a wilderness experience, which was the most wonderful, life-changing experience of my life. The United States Army, Vietnam era, Vietnam. And while I had left the faith intellectually, I don't really believe I had left the faith, because I had to understand a little more theology these days. But I was in a wilderness of doubt. I think not unlike what, well, you mentioned Alcorn earlier. Our friend is now engaging Bart Ehrman in a dialogue in writing. One of my life mottos was never get in an argument with Alcorn. His intellect is prodigious. But anyway, part of the issue is I saw a letter this last week from a girl who I think had probably a similar experience to mine. In my 20s, I wandered, not morally, because my father's imprint was so strong, but I wandered intellectually to the place that he was alarmed, my wife was alarmed, everybody was alarmed, I guess except me. And then to cap the wilderness experience off in the Army, the Lord graciously sent me to Vietnam, where things were no longer theoretical.
Yeah. That's
I
right.
remember a moment where it occurred to me, yeah, I actually could die here, which was kind of a new thought for a stupid, 22 or 23-year-old Army officer to think you don't get risk in the Army. But I remember the smell of cordite and the concussion in the ground, and I was in a little ditch, and I can still remember the red clay of the Central Highlands pushed up against my cheek, and I found myself thinking, well, what if I did die? What difference would it make that I'd ever lived? I'm going to have to get this phone call here. Sorry. What if I did die? What would it matter that I lived? And that started me thinking for months. And in the last 3 or 4 months, sorry about that phone call. My eye was distracted to the phone. In the last 3 or 4 months in Vietnam, all the theoretical about death came home real to me. And in God's graciousness, which you've already mentioned, he brought me back to the heart of my faith in terms of a personal relationship with him. I still had all the questions. I knew all the Bible stories from Vacation Bible School and growing up in Sunday school, but I didn't have a clue as to how they connected. So I told Lindy, when I get home from Vietnam, we're going to go to seminary for a year, and we're going to try to put the Bible together because it's going to govern our lives from here on in. Of course, she was elated because she didn't know what the world she'd married for a few years there.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it was in that process of that first year of seminary that was the richest year of my life spiritually to that point, that my childhood faith came home to an understanding of Scripture that was overwhelming and beautiful. And the last thing I wanted to be was a pastor. I didn't think I was cut out for it, personality-wise or temperament-wise. But the year was so rich, I ended up finishing seminary. We lived on smelt, these little river-running sardines is what they amount to. We lived on that and cheap peas from Safeway for those 3 years with our family of 5. And when I graduated, I knew it wasn't right that I had closed off the pastorate, because you don't do that before the living God. So I went to meet with my old pastor, whom I'd seen run out of town on a rail by some less than spiritual church members. And I told him my problem, and he, I said, I don't want my wife to be a piece of public property. She's my wife. She's not married to everybody in the church.
Yeah.
I don't want my kids to be pastors' kids. And frankly, I don't want to be public property either. And he tilted his head. He said, well, that's pretty much the whole point of the ministry.
That's right.
And it was bang in my chest.
Yeah.
I drove up from Eugene, where he was pastoring at that time, back to the Portland area. I'd been studying 1 John in a Bible study with some college kids, and it just kind of, it wasn't written in flames on my windshield, but I could hear John's words: the things we've touched, the things we've seen, the things we've heard and handled with our hands, we're sharing with you. And I realized at that point that Jesus became a man in order to be manhandled.
That's right.
And so that changed my attitude toward the church and toward ministry and toward sacrifice and my family, and nothing else mattered but the call. So I put my foot in the water slowly, and then before I knew it, God had taken a hold of some things, and we ended up, Randy and I, starting the church together, and it was a glorious 33 years there as lead pastor. And I, in spite of all the humanness of the church, we smell a lot like sheep because we are. God moved in strong ways, and I, who I thought was the least likely candidate for a pastorate, look back now on 33 years, a gift from God to me. And though I have been officially retired now, next month I turn 75, I'm not really retired, and I don't want to be. And but I'll tell you what, this COVID-19 thing, Linda says, you've been retired for some years, but you're finally starting to act like it.
Yeah, there you go.
Nowhere to go.
Yeah, nowhere to run, man. You are
That's
stuck.
right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's been rich for us. We've been married 54 years this summer, and we dated for 6 years before that. So we married as children, and we grew up after we were married together.
Yeah, that's awesome. So take me back real quick on you were at Western Seminary?
Yes.
Yeah, cool.
I
Best professor there. Who was your best professor, and what was the one or two nuggets that just totally stuck with you?
can I say this? All of them were nuggets then. I mean, Western was at its, may I say it this, of course, old dinosaurs always think this way, that I had the privilege of being there in its heyday. And I mean, I had Rodmacher for theology and hermeneutics. I had Ron Allen for Hebrew, who just was in love with God. The one guy I didn't have, because he got there the year I finished, was Brashears, and now I feel like I was robbed because everybody says it's the greatest thing I've ever seen. But I did not have a weak professor. Grant Howard for pastoral duties, which would normally be the killer of seminary, pastoral duties,
Mm-hmm.
But Grant was such a theologian and had come from the pastorate to teach that even pastoral duties was an exciting class. So I loved every minute of it. It was glorious, and I got to work for Earl for 3 years after I graduated, but I couldn't avoid the call to the church. And he tried to say, well, we can really use you here, and there's a future here. And then he said, but doggone it, we can't be discouraged that you're doing what we're training you for. So
yeah. Yeah. So this is going to be a hard question to summarize, but 33 years at Good Shepherd, I'm the benefactor of the ministry there. In fact, when I was back there this last year for Jason's funeral, one of my good friends came with me from Sisters, and he saw the familial relationships. He saw the high touch, and he said, man, what you guys have here is special.
It is.
How would you summarize, if you were to say 33 years?
Well,
okay, there's a lot of high points, a lot of low points.
Yeah.
Okay, break it down.
You're going to have to work to keep me summarizing.
Okay, all right. That's my job. That's my job.
I'm an old man full of stories, but
yeah,
I would say this. I told the boys when they were little, hey, we're never going to do everything perfectly around here, but we are going to do it together.
Yeah.
Because I discovered in understanding who the Lord was as the Father, the Son, and Spirit in perfect oneness, that's the ultimate goal of the church and the ultimate goal of every family. So that's the major, it's more than a nugget, it's actually the vein that keeps on running straight toward the heavenlies, is that we're never going to be perfect, but we are God's children, and by his grace, we're going to learn to live together like Jesus, his Father, and the Holy Spirit live in oneness. And that's probably the greatest nugget. Like I say, it's a whole vein.
Yeah, that was your center point, your heart.
Yep.
That's what kept the church.
And what I had known the church to be was a bunch of scrapping, arguing rascals.
Yeah.
And when I saw I guess this is the corollary to that lesson, get your perspective of the church from Jesus' perspective in the Bible, not from your personal experience.
That's so good. Yeah.
Because the whole point of the church is helping us modify our human nature for selfishness and sinfulness.
Yeah, I heard one pastor say, pastoring is reparenting dysfunctional children into the healthy family of God.
That's not a bad definition. Yep.
And so I can vouch and say, I think some of the years specifically, like in the student ministries when I was a high school student, probably the closest days I can think of where I would say that was the closest thing to a revival, where hundreds and hundreds of students were coming to Christ. I'm looking up at my bulletin board, and Zach Veslick is right there.
Yeah.
And I remember Zach coming, and he was a skater and hacky sack kicking, weed smoking, skateboarding freak, and now he's a missionary, in the middle of Central Asia, putting his life on the line for the gospel. But that was like, there was a season there for sure in the church where there was powerful movement. Yeah. So do you want to say anything more about the pain points of the church?
Criticism. I had a seminary professor, Grant Howard, pastoral duties. He said, you need to understand that criticism is the manure in which God's children grow best and fastest. So I didn't mind the criticism. It's just like taking a round over your head now and then. It's okay. I think that probably the things that I think my idealism stayed with me an awful long time, so that if I probably my major mistake in ministry was not seeing earlier that some people were placed wrongly, hired wrongly, and I should have acted more promptly than I did. And when those things fester longer, they're not helpful for anybody. So, and every church has those dark times because every church is made up of dark humans, all of us.
Mm-hmm.
And those were the hardest and disappointing times. But and it particularly made hard when one or two of the most difficult situations were inspired by fellow staff members who had never outgrown. Well, Paul said he was perfect until he discovered the last commandment and realized he was covetous.
Yeah.
And I think that jealousy, when you're a pastor, you hire for character, not gifting.
Yeah.
And then you find where the gifts fit. But that's probably the biggest lesson out of the dark times. Yeah.
So when you're in the moment where you feel the emotion and you're like, this sucks, I don't like it. Yeah. Where would you go in scripture, and how would you even frame it in your own heart and mind to get, because you still got to preach Sunday, you still got to lead a staff meeting, you still got people calling you, like just walk us into that interpersonal complexity.
Well, more often than I probably could number, I found myself walking toward the pulpit with my Bible in my hand and thinking, as I'm crossing that long platform to get to the pulpit, Lord, you're going to have to see to this one. The work of my hands I'm carrying here. My notes are here, but it's going to have to be your heart that somehow comes through mine to make sense out of this, given the storms through which it's been formed. So that happened many a time. But I'll tell you, Ryan, I this may sound trite, but my favorite passage in Scripture has become Psalm 139. Whenever we studied it in seminary or in some kind of presentation, it was all theological. It was the omniscience, the omnipotence, the omnipresence, all these kinds of things, the absolute sovereignty of God. And while those are all magnificent theological themes and they're all there, I think the whole point of the psalm is the intense personableness of the creator of the universe for the individual. I always used to think, as a kid who grew up, in the church, in the crowd, in the group, that that God was too large, too important, to be worried about the personal details of all of our little lives. And I always took some of those, I guess, growing up in the 60s and being therefore something of a skeptic, though I would never have wanted to admit it. I took all those things as powerfully true, but more as some kind of religious sentiment. Not that they weren't real, but they were good sentiment. I now take them as statements of fact.
Yeah.
Whether when David says, "You know me, you know the way with me, you actually sift and sort my path," and when Jesus says, "The hairs of your head are counted," I used to think that was, a hyperbolic statement. I don't take it that way anymore. I figure the computers of heaven are omnicompetent enough to accomplish that for all of us at the same time forever,
Yeah.
And of course, the numbers of hair on our head, especially mine at 75, changes every day as I look at the shower floor.
Yeah.
But the fact that God, there are several highlights in that psalm, but probably one of the earliest ones is when David says, you go before me and you come behind me and you've got my flanks. As coming out of the military, you're walking point, you're pulling drag, and you have both flanks, and you embrace me, you enfold me. Such knowledge is too lofty for my little brain to get a hold of. But I love it, and I tell you, I've over the course of my life had a few near-death experiences, some of which have taken place in hospital beds, and they have been the most intimate, wonderful, spiritually warm, secure, could I dare use the word happy, as
Yeah.
Randy would use it, happy times of my life.
Yeah.
Um, uh, the worst
Yeah.
of times have been the best of times.
Yeah. I hear you saying the darkness helps you appreciate the light. I hear you saying the pain helps you enjoy the comfort. I hear you actually getting sweet in your old age,
Yeah.
Stu. Believe it or not.
I think
I might even start to call you soft. I mean, you're
yeah,
borderline right now. Yeah.
what did some guy say? It's mellowing, which approximates rottenness.
Yeah.
That's the last step before going rotten.
Yeah.
But I think that's true, Ryan.
Yeah.
And I think that's what David was saying when he said, "There's nowhere I can get
Yeah.
away from you.
Yeah.
There's no way I could be lost. There's no way I'm far from you. You're
Yeah.
at the deepest oceans. You are light and darkness.
Yeah.
It's the same to you." You know?
Yeah. You remind me of my friend John Warehouse. I don't know if you know John.
I don't think so.
He's a little older than you, but he's in our church now. He's a retired pastor. He had a large church down in Southern California, and he's an amazing athlete. He was USC Hall of Fame in baseball
Mm,
and basketball. He got drafted by the Dodgers and the Lakers.
wow.
That's two more pro sports teams that drafted him than drafted me or you.
Exactly. Yeah.
You know what I mean?
You're total.
Yeah, exactly. But he's just a model of a man that's aging so sweet, and we need those models. So that is really encouraging.
Well, there's a reason he chose the word elder.
That's right.
It's not elderly, but it's elder-like.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Yeah.
That's rich. Our greatest elders over the years, in my mind, have been guys in their upper 70s and in their lower 80s.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So when you look at the church today, let's get to the current, and we can speak to the the COVID situation too, but maybe even before COVID, I would be curious to hear your perspective on what do you see, what are you encouraged by, and what causes trouble or what causes concern.
Yeah. Well, some things change over time and some things never change.
Yeah.
Human nature never changes until God gets a hold of it and transforms it.
Yeah.
So it's the same things through the years. Everything's different and everything's the same, as they say. I think the thing that's perhaps most encouraging out of the current generation that we all talk about is the thirst for authenticity. Who doesn't want authenticity? Authenticity doesn't mean it's formless. It doesn't mean it's unstructured. It doesn't mean it's disordered. That sometimes it appears to mean that to the younger generation, but authenticity is very encouraging to me. We don't have to wear ties. And you know what? I had to help some of our people understand it. You can come into the auditorium with a baseball hat on backwards. And at first
I helped help them understand that.
No
that was my role.
No doubt. Beloved rebel.
I was just making sure there wasn't legalism in the church.
What a calling,
Yeah.
Yeah. But everywhere there's humans, there's going to be legalism. I mean,
yeah, that's right.
I mean, when we started, we preached in coats and ties.
Yeah.
And then we let the tie go. And I remember asking one of the musicians to wear something other than a t-shirt when he was playing the piano on the platform, and he said, "But this is who I am." And I said, "Okay, I get that. Wear your t-shirt, but be real before Jesus."
Yeah.
And don't just look that way because it's what everybody looks like.
That's right.
I don't even remember what your question was now.
So yeah, just that's what you're encouraged by, I guess, in the church is the authenticity.
Yeah.
But what do you see as potential risks or blind spots?
Well, you mentioned the coronavirus. It's heavy on my mind for the church because of the difficult position it puts us in, having to walk a balance between doing what the church is called to do. That is, the word church means assemble. You're called out of your little homes into this assembly to look like me. And I think we're in danger of allowing the church to be considered a non-essential business
Yeah. Yeah.
in the current environment. So I think we need to get to that and discuss our relationship to our civil government, for which we're very grateful, of course. So we've enjoyed the greatest one in, I think, the history of the earth. But human nature doesn't change, and culture does, and our culture changes after the human nature that's governing it. And I know we talk about my father's generation as the greatest generation, the survivors of the Depression that won World War II and all that sort of thing. But I believe the greatest generation were the founders, who were largely well-to-do men ahead of their time in both education and intellect. But they understood that we draw our identity from the nature of God, actually.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. And let me just pause real quick, because that's a great point. And the cultural moment we're in is that you define meaning and you define identity by looking in. And that is a major shift.
Yes.
And it's happened sneakily. It's happened very subversively.
Yes.
But that is a major shift
It is.
of how we've ever looked at identity.
Yeah, we know who's behind that.
Yeah.
And there's no place it's more obvious in terms of gender identity.
Yeah.
You know, there's now 9 of them now,
Yeah.
supposedly. Well, that's a direct attack of the evil one upon the image and nature of God. And we need to see it in those terms as a church in order to be what we're supposed to be authentically in this time of exaggerated, accelerated erosion and loss.
Yeah, which we're, I guess, calling progress, which
Yes.
is sneaky too.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the average person out there, they're going to hear this and go, yeah, okay. They're going to nod. My question is, so what do we do? What's the average person do? Let me give you an example. Yesterday, I met with Deschutes County Commissioner to do 2 things. One, say, thank you for the work you're doing. How can we help?
Yes.
Let's find the most vulnerable and needy. Let's do it. I'm in.
Good for you.
And then the second thing is, hey, can I share some concerns? Can you? So what's the average person out there able to do? How should we be thinking about this? Not just church proper with your structure and your leaders. I'm just thinking the average person who is part of the church. How do they move forward into this and actually see change?
I think it's impossible without the assembly.
Yeah.
He called us sheep for a reason. We flock together, and we. I don't know where to start on this except at the beginning, and so you turned me off.
I'm in charge of your microphone. This is the reverse of how it used to be. You used to be in charge of my microphone.
Yeah, you're in charge. You got the controls. But I mean, you and I know, as Bible-believing, Christ-following people, that everything starts with the nature of God. He is the creator of all things. And it's the nature of God. I mean, he's 3 in 1. And you read that first chapter of Genesis, and it sounds almost like a ho-hum. He created the whole universe. And then it becomes personal when he says, let's make a creature in our image. And he made male and female so that they could be one and reproduce after their kind the way he does, you know? So everything is about assembly. Page 1 of the Bible. Alone is not good.
Yeah.
You weren't built for alone. You were built in the image of God. You need together. That's what this is all about. And it's supposed to be that way. And then you walk through those first 11 chapters of prehistory and Genesis, and you get to chapter 11, and God's heart is broken because, you know, the flood didn't work. Nothing's working with these people. And his heart is broken because they're turning the essence of his image, their oneness, against him.
That's right.
The gift of language and union and communion and communication, they were turned against him to create a God of their own making. And he says to his, I hope it's not sacrilegious to call our God, the first small group, Father, Son, and Spirit. But he says, let us go down and confuse that. Behold how they are one. Now nothing will be impossible for them.
Yeah, it's the seminal anti-kingdom, right?
Totally.
Babel, Genesis 11.
Totally.
It's the moment of the great rebellion, and it shows you the amazing power of oneness used against God, right?
Yeah. Even there is something about his nature that is so powerful that even to the falsified degree, it still has impact.
Yeah.
And of course, that's the heels of the promise. Then is Genesis 12, where he says all the peoples are going to come together through this particular covenant and blessing upon Abraham. It still governs our life today. And yet, you read the Old Testament even, and God is a gatherer. You know, he's going to the east and the west and the points of the compass, and I'm never going to leave you. I'm going to bring you all together. I want you together in Jerusalem, 3 times majorly a year. We're about coming together. And then when Jesus comes in the New Testament, he says, I will build my assembly, my church. It's going to look like me. It's not going to look like that one back there in Genesis 11. It's going to look like the one that I build. And the only thing I'm doing on earth, for heaven's sake, right now, is building my assembly. So if there is an essential business on this planet, it is the church. The essence. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And
and just one comment too. I think one of my Bible profs showed me this, that Acts 2, the birth of the church, is the reverse of Genesis 11.
That's right.
So they were confused in language. God confuses them.
Yep.
And then the languages are unconfused.
Absolutely.
And so we see a full circle, a beautiful biblical theological completion.
Scythians and Parthians and Medes and Persians and every stripe and tongue, and they're coming together as one.
That's right.
And that's what Ephesians is all about. All of this, a plan from eternity past, with this magnificent sovereign appointment, is that he might show the creatures in the high places what his grace can do.
Yeah.
And he even uses the church in the word order. He says, to him be glory in the church and in Christ Jesus. Well, that's, what word order is in that original language. It's like an important factor.
Right.
And he put the church up there as an expression of Jesus, right with Christ.
Yeah.
And then everything out of there is relational in chapter 4. I therefore beg you to act this way with each other, for there's one. So we're being asked at this point by civil authority to put aside, at least temporarily, the essence of who we are. And that is at best very temporary and clearly impossible. You can't do that and be the church. You can't separate and be the church.
That's right.
So that's the conundrum that we're all facing today.
So how are you guys doing this at Good Shepherd?
Well,
let me ask you this. That's backwashing. Better question. How would you do this if you were still leading right now? Like, what would your ideal Stu Weber self do in this situation?
Very carefully and very determinedly, I guess, is the way we're very alert to Romans 13 and 14 and all the passages about obedience to authority. And I, of all people, having grown up in all the derision of the 60s, I have a real affinity for getting with the program and not protesting out there doing your own thing.
That's right.
I don't like that. I had to battle that all those days. And of course,
because you had people protesting you.
Yeah, I was in the
it's no fun.
program. Yeah, the Army was paying for my college.
Yeah.
So I'm walking down the street with a uniform with my peers on both sides, yelling and screaming and calling you names. And I mean, you were the same kid 20 minutes ago that didn't have the uniform on and played football, and now you're an idiot because you're in this uniform. So I have an aversion to that kind of protest and that kind of ugly thing. And I know it's guaranteed, the right to assemble and protest the Constitution, but I might have a personal aversion to it. But too long, too many stories. But would say this: there comes a time to step away, even from the authority of the greatest government the earth has ever seen, humanly speaking, the United States government. There comes a time to step away from some of the sheepish following and to become a true member of Christ's body and understand that no matter how great a government may be, if government commands what God forbids, I can't do it.
Mm-hmm.
And if government forbids what God commands, I can't do it. I
Yeah.
have to follow God. So I have to move against government. But here's the redeeming factor for me, Ryan, and I don't think I'm just soothing my own conscience with this. I think the argument can be made that the United States enjoys the greatest human government that this planet has observed over the span of history. And one of the advantages we enjoy is the fact that there is no man who is Caesar in this country, nor no woman. There's no individual that's Caesar. There is a Constitution that is Caesar. The United States Constitution governs, and that Constitution enumerates. In fact, it wouldn't exist if the little people for the convention of 1787 and all, if the little people had said, we appreciate all the language, we appreciate what might have been called the flowery language of that day, but we want a list. We want a list of guarantees. It's called the Bill of Rights. And number one is we can assemble whenever we choose to assemble.
Yeah.
And we can worship however we choose to worship. And number two is we have the right to bear arms to protect that first one, you know?
Yeah.
And so I think we have the luxury, if you could call it that, in our world of knowing the high and lofty one and his book, and of living in this environment where we can be obedient to Caesar as the Constitution, and it doesn't mean that we have to unquestionably bow before some local authority. I don't know how else to say that. I don't mean to be unkind to anybody, but the fact is, it's the Constitution that governs this country, and it's not a personality or a person.
Yeah.
So
a few comments I'll just make about that. I think if and when it's not a question of if we should civilly disobey, it's when. And so now it's a question of, timing. Can we do Hebrews 10, 24, 25, not give a meeting together? Can we do that within the a reasonable purview of our government's request? Is there a way we can do that? And I think there is a season where I'm willing to say, yeah, we can be the home church communities, and we can still pray for each other. In fact, this might be the great opportunity for home church leaders to go, dude, it's time for me to pastor differently. It's time for me to, yeah. And so I want to see that played out, but there also, for me, in this local context, there is a time, and I don't know when it is yet. I'm praying through that, but it's through the lens of honoring the emperor. I will have a meeting with another commissioner. I will meet again. I will take the steps, and it will be the last ditch effort. I'm averse to saying, let's start by picketing in Salem with our guns. I don't think that's the way we start.
I'm totally with you.
Yeah.
I'm totally with you.
I think the second thing for me that I'm thinking through is, as much as I love the assembly of the people of God, the early church had this they had this incredible flexibility to do the commands of Jesus in far greater, more dangerous situations that we find ourselves. So, when Peter says in 1 Peter 2, honor the emperor, he's not talking about someone who he disagrees with. He's talking about Nero, who's burning cities and blaming Christians.
That's right.
And so we've got to look at it and go, man, is there a way we can? So I think for me, where I've landed today, and this can shift tomorrow, but where I've landed today is when I look at Acts 5:29, we command you not to speak in the name. We must obey God rather than men. It's when they single out the church of Jesus as as no longer. Now, I do think I have a big problem with the essential list, and those are the reasons I'm meeting with commissioners. I'd like you to walk me through how you've defined what's essential, what's not. How did
Yeah.
car detailing make it on list 1 and
Yeah.
church on list 4? Just walk me through that.
Yeah, exactly. Good for
Yeah.
you.
Yeah. So I also think there's a time and a place for, in Acts 22, I appeal to
Caesar.
Rome. I appeal to Caesar as a Roman citizen. And I do think we have a obligation as the people of God to honor and then hold up these documents and say, hey, how are you doing with your job description?
Exactly.
So it takes gospel wit, because we live in an outrage culture.
Yep.
Where everyone wants to be angry and everyone wants to respond.
Yep.
And
well, the beautiful side of this conundrum that we find ourselves in is it may actually, God may actually use it to develop a spirit of revival inside the church, because too many churches have become clubs and they're conveniences, and they're easy to miss if you've got to go to the beach or whatever, and I'm not against any of that, because Lord knows I've done it. Well, not so much the beach, but the mountains.
You're right.
So I do believe, as you know, in a plurality of leadership, that the elder managed church.
Yeah.
And I believe you will know the when to disobey civil authority in the plurality of the council of the elders coming together. And they make the decision together that this is what we're going to do. In the meantime, I think it's a great revival for small groups. We have lost a freedom temporarily, and it doesn't taste good, and it's made us hungry. And so there was a small group of less than 10 people gathered recently at a property that's dear to me, and it was a rich gathering, and it made people realize this is really important to us. Yeah. So this may move the church from clubbishness and membership on paper to actual body life, and that's a really good thing.
That is so good, and I really think people need to hear that right now.
I do too.
Let's so good.
Let's use it that way. It's okay to do the virtual church thing. In fact, I would say a couple of the last recent weeks for us at Good Shepherd have been some of the more meaningful worship services, and we were spread out through our homes in the community with our leaders leading us in worship in a small group, 4 or 5 musicians and a preacher. And it was, I mean, may I say this as an older man, I was wonderfully moved to what we used to say in the Army was my eyeballs were sweating.
Yeah, exactly.
I actually was brought to tears in the authentic nature of worship, because those leading me were so real, and the God we were worshiping was ultimately real. So I think there's a revival there for us. But at some point, we need to ask what you were asking the commissioner. How did you derive this list of essentials? Nothing is more essential than that we stay together in our spirits. And nothing is more critical to nurturing our spirits than the only organization that really is spiritual. So we need to be on the essential list. Now we need to do the safety things and all that sort of thing. And here's another, it just struck me the other day. I believe, as a good evangelical Protestant Bible-believing Christ follower, that the highest ecclesiastical organization on the earth is the local church, and it's governed by that local body of elders, and we learn from each other as churches, but the Spirit of God superintends all the church with the capital C, and he is capable of moving different groups at different times to different tactics. And I just read yesterday, and I have to admit that my spirit connects with this guy. It's a little church in Maine. I don't know very much about him. I think the pastor may be a friend of one of my friends, but they have decided to step forward and sue the government for prohibiting them from assembling, which in their case is denying their identity, which is the big issue these days. So I say, well, more power to them. I'm going to pray for them, because they're going to need a lot of prayer, and they're going to need a lot of legal help. but they have gone ahead, but under their elders, and they've kind of tossed the gauntlet in the ring and said, okay, here's what we're doing. We're keeping all the social distancing. We're doing all these things, but we're still going to assemble on the Lord's Day, and we're going to worship Him as a group. And you can't stop that, other than by arresting us and jailing us.
Yeah.
So they've crossed the line in that one, and I don't fault them for it.
Yeah.
And I wish them the best, and they have my prayers. So that may start the larger picture in terms of our own culture here.
Yeah. Yeah. Two thoughts. One is, I think we just need to be really careful of the hypocrisy and not to these people's anything these people have done, but what I mean when I say that is we celebrate the persecuted church in China. So I see people go, man, what the Chinese do to gather underground, and then the minute we have a little bit of discouragement, we automatically listen. So there's part of me that really admires these churches that are saying, like, we're not just going to celebrate God's movement in the underground church in China. We're going to become the persecuted church. And I think there's part of that I really think we need to pay attention to and be thoughtful about. The second thing that you said, and I think I can't stress more, if the governor said tomorrow, hey, churches can meet, we still have to figure out how we do this safely. Like, there still is a real virus.
That's right.
Now, what is the extent of that real virus? We could talk a lot. We could talk, but since we're clueless about pretty much anything, we won't comment on that. So we do need to think, how do we protect the vulnerable and the weak amongst us once we can gather again?
That's right.
So those are good words too.
Absolutely. And in the background of that is that strong verb that you mentioned in Hebrews 10:25. You cannot forsake, you cannot abandon, you cannot leave it behind. You can temporarily take some other measures, but you cannot abandon it.
Yep.
And that's clear command of Scripture. So people wiser than me are going to have to be involved in that at the core. And I have to admit, when I read this morning of that little church in that had filed suit, I found myself identifying with them. And I found myself praying for them. And,
that's cool.
Maybe they're the tip of the spear in this particular case. I don't know. You ask what I would do at Good Shepherd. I would hope that I would be wise enough to do what you're doing, to reach out to the local civil authorities and to be meeting constantly as elders to try to wrestle with what kind of clues are we going to need to see in order to just haul off and come back together. Because our quarantine is not indefinite, because we do have a command that's direct, that fills out all the theology of Scripture. Hey, we got a buddy. Hi, pal.
Okay, we're going to wrap this up pretty quick. So I guess my last thing is, like, any final words, any final thoughts, any final, like, just life mottos, life versus life bullet points that you just want to sign off?
Well, kind of our little learning together to live like Christ motto.
Yeah.
We're all learning. Nobody's arrived, not the pastor, not the cradle roll. But we're going to learn together, because that's the nature of the Trinity and the nature of the God we worship. It's got to be together.
Yeah.
And it's to live. It's not to recite. It's not to look good. It's not to join a club on Sundays. It's to live like Jesus, who at times had nothing to say to certain people because they were so antagonistic, and who we tend to emphasize as a church, and rightly so, Jesus' first coming as the model of the church. We're his body. We live out like he lived. He came as the Lamb of God. He came to die for the sins of the world. But we don't read the whole counsel of God as often and realize that the Lion of Judah is going to put an end to all of the silliness down here with blood to the horse's bridle level. So the shepherding, the good shepherd, the only good shepherd, is also a warrior who died on a piece of high ground, shedding his blood so he could free people forever. So that it's a balance, man. And that's why it's a plurality of elders in council.
Yeah, that's right. Grace and truth, as Randy would say. Well,
Yep.
John 1. And I appreciate that call of learning, because we've got to come into all of the complexities of church, even at a normal time, with humility,
Mhm.
and where we're at in the cultural pressures and the political pressures and the polarization of the outrage culture we're in. Man, we have got to be innocent as doves and then shrewd as serpents.
That's been my favorite verse in this particular season.
Yeah.
And it's both.
Yeah, that's right.
It is harmless, but it is as intelligent
Yeah.
as a serpent. We have to be appropriately, I hate to even use the word snakish, but
I like to use the word witty.
yeah.
Wit and nuanced.
Yeah. Well, you're on the right track, my young friend. I commend you as one old salt to a younger one. You're on the right track by approaching your local authorities and asking them honestly, what can we do to help?
Yeah.
And then at the same time, when it gets to that point, whenever it is, be willing to, I hate to use the analogy of pulling the trigger, but you know what I mean, taking steps that says we're going to assemble.
Yeah.
You know,
that's right.
We're there. And then
Hey,
I watch what's happening some dark places. That we're on the edge of all kinds of things happening that are really ugly just in the general population. So we need to guard against that.
Yeah. Stu, thank you for your time. Thanks for your life, your ministry, your leadership. We love the Webers. It's awesome having Blake here. Been fun seeing Riley, and Riley's a reader, man. She
is.
What else can I read?
She is a force.
I love it, man. It's pretty cool. So
She's
yeah,
kind
it's
of
fun
a block off the old chip.
Yeah. I know Blake sells books. She actually reads them. So
and he listens to them.
Yeah, exactly.
Mr. Audible. Hey,
Yeah.
God bless you, Ryan, and thanks for the time together. I love you, man.
Love you, buddy. See ya. Bye.
Bye-bye.